the only way we're going to get some of this oppression and exploitation away from us or aside from us is come together.
Let's hear it from El Boogie.
Hi, everyone. You on was listening to El Boogie. We're burning the midnight oil tonight. Hey, but we're going to jump right on in and we're going to get this thing started. And tonight we're going to discuss foundational Black Americans will not forgive America's original sin of slavery. I've been listening to some Black conservatives, and see, can we get this one? And some of them seem to think that we should forgive. We should forgive and forget everything that's happened, that transpired during slavery, and the fact that slavery moved America very quick to success in a short period of time. And but I will say this: I don't think slavery is a reason for us not to achieve excellence. You do have some of our people that use excuses for not making an effort to do the right thing when it comes to like raising our families, respecting the institution of marriage. At one time we had standards. There were certain things that were done. If things weren't done a certain way, it would bring shame on our family. Then, you know, people would be ostracized for it. So let's take, for instance, being married out of wedlock. That wasn't tolerated. So if you had a boy and a girl, they messed around and got pregnant, young man got a young lady pregnant, then the parents would come together and would make them get married. You know, because it was a thing. They had a standard then. And the standard was, if y'all want to be grown, you're gonna get married, and you're not gonna bring shame on my family by not being married. We had standards. You know, it wasn't like today where anything goes. So today, the state, we have achieved a lot and we've done a lot of great things, but the Black family is torn apart. You have 70% of homes being headed by single women. You know, the institution of marriage not respected for a lot of different reasons. But at the same time, we have to persevere. We have to start making better decisions. So I'm not going to get on here and make excuses that slavery and Jim Crow and all these things are the reasons why we aren't the people that we should be. I'm not going to do that. In that respect, I have a conservative point of view. There's, I'm not naive saying there's not still barriers, but despite those barriers, we have done a lot in this country. We are just as American as anybody else, and we deserve the fruits that our foreparents survived and sacrificed for us to thrive. That being said, I was listening to a Black conservative, and I listened to a lot of those. They're real disingenuous. You know, they think that we should just move on from slavery and that we shouldn't fight for reparations, that they're against reparations because they see it as a handout. But it's not a handout, it's something that's old. And they would like for Black people to move on from it and forgive and move on, and that is not going to happen. That reparations in the form of cash payments are owed to us. And that's regardless of whether we experience slavery or not. Because the fact that there was slavery puts a lot of people in economic advantage because of what our ancestors went through. This country is what it is because of what our ancestors went through in slavery. So they want to gloss over it, make all kinds of excuses. Well, only 2% of people owned slavery, where the population wasn't all that big in the United States then. So 2% at that time was a lot, you know. And it's just, they they have these straw man arguments that, if you really do research, don't make any sense. So I'm going to start with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation by President Abraham Lincoln. Now, the South succeeded from the Union. The war started when the Confederate Army fired on Fort Sumter. I guess that started the Civil War. They succeeded. Reasons why they succeeded was the North was growing industrial, and they didn't want the planters or slave owners from the South to have control of the country, because what they were doing, they were counting their slaves as 3/4 of a human in order to have representation in Congress and the Senate. So they didn't want slavery spread to the North, and it's not that they cared about the slaves. Excuse me, they just didn't want the institution spread into the North, because they was about industry or production or whatever. And slaves was free labor, and that would take jobs away from cats in the North. See what I'm saying? So there was a double-edged sword, and the North was trying to coerce the South into giving up their slaves, not because they cared, but because it was inconvenience, and they didn't feel like it was a good thing for the progression of the United States or the Union. So the Southern cats was like, you can pry my slaves from my cold dead hand, and it's on and popping. So the Civil War started. Okay, when the war started, the Union had won a battle. They was getting it taken. They was getting it taken to them. So Lincoln's generals, along with Frederick Douglass, was in his behind about signing the Emancipation Proclamation so that slaves could join the war effort. And he signed it, not because he cared about the slaves. So let's not be, come on now. He said he would sign, he said he would sign it, he would free all of the slaves or none of the slaves. His main aim was to preserve the Union. That's what his aim was. So he was doing what's best, was to preserve the Union. But he was smart. He knew that it would go down in history that if they didn't win a battle first, it would go down in history that he freed the slaves to save the Union, which technically is what happened. But they fought the bloody war of Antietam, counted a few less casualties than the other side, declared victory, and then he signed it. And then you had a number of black slaves that escaped their plantations to go fight for the Union Army. I've done some research, and so you had black regiments, a lot of black regiments in the Civil War. You had the first black regiment was from North Carolina. It was the first North Carolina Colored Volunteers. Then you had the 55th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, the 31st Infantry Regiment, and there was a total of 175 regiments total. But another black regiment was the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. Then you had the 29th Connecticut Infantry, the 54th Massachusetts, which is famous. They shot the movie where Denzel Washington won his first his Oscar as Best Supporting Actor. Then you had the 30th Connecticut Infantry. Okay. Now, this all the regiments was disbanded October of 1865. Um, but the Civil War started May 22nd, 1863, and ended October 1865. All of the troops was in the army. They served in infantry. The black troops, that is, served in infantry. Of course, you did have white troops, but I'm talking about the black troops' contribution to the war effort. They were in infantry, cavalry, artillery, and engineering. Okay. Um, okay. Now, some disadvantages of black soldiers serving in the Union Army were if they were captured by the Confederacy, they could be sold back into slavery, but many of them were murdered. There were mass graves found in sites where the Civil War was fought. With mass graves with the skeletons of powerful men, cats with wide shoulders and big arms. So they were determined to be mass graves of black Union soldiers. That's deep. So at times, black soldiers weren't allowed to wave the white flag. There's conflicting stories or whatever. They weren't allowed, and as far as I think, they weren't allowed to fly, to wave to give up and wave the yellow flag. And I'm assuming they call it the black flag because a lot of them they were just murdered, and then if they weren't murdered, they were sent back to the plantation. But a great many of them was murdered. So you had an instance at Fort Pillow. You had the Fort Pillow massacre of 1864, where 300 they say 300 soldiers were killed, mostly black soldiers. So you had that type of thing going, because you got to think that the Confederates were angry. You know what I'm saying? They fight the war, and then on top of that, they cotton not getting picked and tobacco and whatever else not going on. Because I'm assuming there was mostly women and children left on the plantation, because the men had bounced and went to go fight for the Union Army on the Union side, because they were pissed. They were gonna catch them and weren't gonna end good in most cases. But that being said, the war, the soldiers, they turned the tide of the war. So in the beginning, when the soldiers were being trained, the black soldiers were being trained by mostly white officers. And it ain't like they loved them either. They didn't love the black soldiers. They didn't. They trained them. Maybe some officers were better than others, but for the most part, they didn't like. It ain't like they liked them. If you think about it, considering it's like, okay, we got to train these black troops or these slaves, so they can help us preserve the Union, which is really what happened. Because after that, the tide of the war turned, and the Union ended up winning. Okay, so we have a state. You know what I'm saying? Because there wouldn't be no America if it wasn't for that effort. That's the way I see it. So what happened was they won the war, and now it's time for Reconstruction. So I got a little information about that, and I'm gonna share my screen with you guys, and we're gonna go over it. So we're gonna do this. Share screen. I'm gonna hit this right. Share. Okay, I don't know if you guys can see me or not. If you can, good. If you can't, cool. But we're gonna go over what happened that ended Reconstruction. All right. Reconstruction ended. During Reconstruction, the South was being occupied by Union soldiers, Union troops, or whatever, and a lot of former slaves were elected to office. They were elected to Congress, And the Senate, um, they had the right to vote. Um, they were Republicans. The first elected blacks to Congress and the Senate were Republicans. Louisiana, and he says former slaves were elected to office across southern states, from local positions and statewide offices and U.S. Congress. Former slaves held office in Mississippi and Louisiana, and a lot of offices in Mississippi and Louisiana because of the black population in those states. Now, what happened? What ended all that and sent our people back into semi-slavery and Jim Crow for the next 100 years was when there was, as a result of the Great Compromise of 1877. And I just posed the question, why were the Union troops removed from the South? Union troops were removed from the South as a result of the Compromise of 1877, a political deal that settled the dispute of the 1876 presidential election. All right. What happened was during this time, this withdrawal formally ended Reconstruction era and allowed Democrats known as Redeemers to regain control of the Southern states government. Now, here what happened during the compromise, which is, I call it betrayal, because it's exactly what it was. It was betrayal. Okay. The immediate reason for the removal of federal troops was contentious and of the 1876 presidential election between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. All right. The results in Florida. Hey, don't this sound familiar? There was a dispute with the count of the votes. So Florida, it seems like Florida is always involved in a dispute when they counting votes for the presidents. It's crazy. Okay, the results in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina were disputed, with both parties claiming victory. This left the election outcome in limbo for months. So there was a secret deal to end the standoff. Republicans, allies of Hayes, met with Southern Democrats. The Democrats agreed not to block Hayes' path to the presidency. And in return, Hayes agreed to withdraw the remaining federal troops from the South. The result, after Hayes' inauguration in March of 1877, he ordered the removal of troops from Louisiana and South Carolina. This solidified Democratic control across the South and ended federal military intervention. Now, you have some broader reasons for the end of Reconstruction, in addition to what led up to this. Okay. The Compromise of 1877. Then you had Northern fatigue and shifting priorities. By the mid 1870s, many Northerners had grown weary of the cost of continued conflict or military occupation. Public attention shifted to other issues such as economic depression following the Panic of 1873. Then you had the resurgence of white Southern Democrats. Former Democrat leaders and other white Southerners opposed Reconstruction policies and used political and violent means to reclaim power. The Redeemer movement, Southern Democrats who called themselves Redeemers, worked to reverse the political and social gains of Black Americans and restore to old racial hierarchy. Intimidation and violence. Parliamentary groups like the White League and the Red Shirts intimidated Black voters and their Republican allies, making it difficult for them to participate in the political process. Then you had a number of Supreme Court rulings. During the 1870s, the Supreme Court issued rulings that weakened the federal government's ability to protect the civil rights of Black people. These decisions emboldened opponents of Reconstruction. Then you had some political scandals. The Grant administration was plagued by scandals which undermined public trust in the Republican Party and weakened support for its Reconstruction policies. The aftermath of it all, the withdrawal of federal troops had several consequences for Black Southerners. With federal protection gone, Southern Democrats moved quickly to dismantle the progress made during Reconstruction. Okay. And what did it lead to? Widespread voter disenfranchisement, the rise of exploitive sharecropping systems, the implementation of Jim Crow segregation, and the intensification of racial violence and intimidation. Okay, and this and as a result of all this, Jim Crow was ushered in, and this was a setback for the next 100 years. So you have these Black conservatives; they're very real. They're real disingenuous about what happened. They don't want to discuss all the I would call it the aggravating circumstances behind what went on with our people at that time. So then you had Jim Crow. You said, when did Jim Crow start and end? Jim Crow laws, which legalized racial discrimination, began in the late 1870s after the end of Reconstruction and were dismantled by the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts passed in 1964 and 1965. This was not long ago. It was not long ago. I was born September of 1964. So for you young people that's listening, this was not a long time ago. You know, you may have grandparents that's my age. And you may have great grandparents that actually lived doing Jim Crow. Of course, I was born at the end, towards the end of what was going on at that time. So at the start of the Jim Crow era, and the start of the Jim Crow era started with the end of Reconstruction. Following the Compromise of 1877, federal troops were removed from the South, which allowed Southern Democrats, the Redeemers, to regain control of the state legislatures. Then you had codification of segregation. These legislatures passed laws requiring the segregation of races in most public facilities, such as transportation and schools. These statutes were often preceded by black codes passed immediately after the Civil War, which limited the rights of formerly enslaved people. And here comes the Supreme Court again. The U.S. Supreme Court legitimized this segregation with its infamous 1896 ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson. The decision established the separate but equal doctrine, providing the legal justification for discriminatory Jim Crow laws for decades. Then what ushered in the end of Jim Crow. The Jim Crow system was not overturned with a single act, but gradually dismantled by the Civil Rights Movement and subsequent legislation in the 1950s and 60s. In other words, these laws were not passed without social disobedience and social unrest. Protests, sit-ins, and all this brought all this about. So nothing was given to us. Nothing. The right to vote or the right to do anything else, and the right for you people in this day and time to breathe was not for free. Okay. So the first thing you had to happen was Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. This landmark Supreme Court case declared that state-sponsored segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Excuse me. Directly reversing the separate but equal precedent. Then you had a Civil Rights Act of 1964. Just 60 or 60 years old. That's not long ago. This federal law outlaws segregation in public accommodations such as hotels and restaurants and prohibited discrimination in employment. Then you had the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Now, after the Voting Rights Act, we have not had a win, not a win specific to our situation. We haven't had one since this. This act outlawed. This act outlawed voting practices such as literacy tests that have been used to disenfranchise black voters. All right. Now, after this, it ain't like things got better overnight to how, we still have improvements today, but things after the 1965 Civil Rights Voting Act, or the Voting Act of 1965, you had a lot of, they didn't stop. They began to do other things to impede our process and kind of like prevent us from building generational wealth and things of that sort. So what they started to do as we doing segregation, of course, we had our own everything. We had our own towns, had their own movie theaters, own bus companies, own cab companies, own restaurants, own movie theaters, because we're separate. So we had our own thriving communities. So then they would enact laws to try to bust up our thriving communities. Excuse me. So what law allowed highways to be built through black neighborhoods? The key legislation that enabled highways to be built through black neighborhoods was the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which worked in conjunction with an earlier urban renewal law, worked in conjunction with earlier urban renewal laws like the Housing Act of 1949. While neither law explicitly targeted black communities, the way they were implemented at the local level systematically and disproportionately destroyed black neighborhoods under the guise of slum clearance. Then you had the process of urban renewal. This infrastructure development was framed as progress, but the process inflicted lasting damage on minority communities. Okay, you had the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. This landmark law authorized the construction of the interstate highway system in America, like you got I-95, 85, and stuff like that. Okay. It's funded 90% of construction costs, a powerful incentive for states to build. Okay. Then you had strategic routing. In many cities, highway planners intentionally routed new interstates through black and low income areas. These neighborhoods were seen as convenient, undesirable, and lacked the political power to resist. Then you had the Housing Act of 1949. This law provided federal funding to cities for urban renewal, which meant clearing areas deemed blighted. Cities used the law to require land through eminent domain, forcibly evicting residents and demolishing homes to make way for highways. So you had eminent domain and displacement. The government used eminent domain to seize homes and businesses. Many displaced residents received minimal compensation and had few housing options due to segregation and redlining. This destroyed generational wealth and pushed residents into overcrowded, still segregated areas. Okay, you had examples of affected communities. The practice gutted thriving black communities in cities across the nation. Okay, you had Overtown in Miami. I-95 was routed directly through this vibrant economic and cultural hub of Miami's black community, displacing thousands of residents. Then you had the Rondo St. Paul. The construction of I-94 split tight-knit Rondo community in half, leading to the loss of hundreds of homes and businesses. Then you had the Hill District in Pittsburgh. The Civic Arena project, built as part of the urban renewal efforts, displaced thousands of black residents and destroyed the cultural heart of the neighborhood. All right. And then besides that, you had lynching and terror. You know, that's an intimidation tactic to keep, black folk in line. So how often did lynchings occur? During the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, lynchings were frequent, particularly in the South. The frequency varied over time, peaking in the 1890s and then gradually declining through spikes in violence. Those spikes in violence occurred during events like the Great Depression and post World War II. While many lynchings went unrecorded, historical data provides a grim picture of their prevalence. Here's some statistics of lynching. Okay. Peak years. Lynchings were most frequent in the period between 1882 and 1901, with an average of over 150 per year. I'm going to say this again. I'm going to repeat. Lynchings were most frequent in the period between 1882 and 1901, with an average of over 150 per year. And they're talking about forgiving police. In 1882, the peak year for recording lynchings was 1892 with 250 deaths. That's one count. Now, the NAACP recorded 4,743 lynchings in the U.S. between 1882 and 1968. I was 4 years old in 1968, 4 or 3, depending on when they took count. Okay, other organizations like the Equal Justice Initiative have documented slightly different figures based on their research. Historians widely agree that the actual number is likely higher due to underreporting. So, excuse me, people disappearing, you don't even know where the hell they at. Somebody got a hold of them, and that happened in a lot of families in the South. Excuse me. And that's why that was the Great Migration, where people just left the South because it was just unbearable, because they traded in the nonsense that was going on in the South to northern slums. So I guess, it was what it was at the time. But the racial demographics of the lynching record between 1882 and 1968, approximately 72% or 3,446 of the victims were black. In the Deep South, the percentage of black victims was even higher. All right. Geographic concentration. The overwhelming majority of lynchings were concentrated in the South, where white mobs used them to terrorize and control black population and enforce white supremacy. Then there's the context of violence. Okay. The consistent rate of lynchings throughout this period meant that the terror was a constant and predictable part of the life of many African Americans in the South. The violence was not a random occurrence, but a systemic practice of racial terror. Okay. And this occurred in 3 different ways. It occurred through public spectacles, dubious accusations, and lack of justice. Public spectacles lynchings were often public events, like after church. There's, old flyers, where you can see where they announced the lynching after church. It's crazy. Attended by large white crowds as a form of social celebration. Photographs of the victims were sometimes sold as souvenir postcards. Then there was dubious accusations. Fabricated accusations, most notoriously claims of sexual assault against white women, were used to justify the murders. Many victims were killed for simply violating social customs or expectations of racial difference. Lack of justice. The perpetrators of lynching were almost never punished. All white juries ensured that even when charged, the mob members would be acquitted. Public officials at the state and local levels often supported the mobs or refused to intervene. Okay. Now, we're going to go back to the impact of slavery. Okay. I'm gonna check on you guys and see how we doing. Seems like we're doing pretty good. So I'm gonna go in and give you guys this. All right. And during the slavery, there was free labor. So if you had a business, whatever the business was, and you didn't have to pay anybody, that advanced your business well. And oftentimes, excuse me, more often than not, um, they kept insurance on their property, and their property was human beings. So cotton was king in the South. So I was wondering to myself, and I posed the question: what impact did the cotton industry have on the advancement of the American economy during slavery? You may be surprised and you may not. The cotton industry inextricably linked to the institution of slavery had a profound and complex impact on the American economy during the antebellum period. Okay. You had the dominant agricultural export. You had it fueled industrialization. There was expansion of slavery. You had it was financial power and borrowing capacity. It created that. It stimulated domestic trade, generated wealth, and then there was urban growth and development. Okay, we're gonna go over each one of these. Dominant agricultural export, cotton, which was picked by slaves. Cotton became the leading cash crop of the South, exceeding the economic importance of tobacco, rice, and sugar. By 1860, the region produced 2/3 of the world's cotton supply. Cotton was also America's primary export, comprising over half of all American exports during the first half of the 19th century. This dominance positioned the U.S. as the world leader in cotton production. It fueled industrialization. Grow Southern slave grown cotton was essential in powering the textile mills of the North and Great Britain during the Industrial Revolution. This global demand stimulated economic growth both domestically and internationally. Then there was the expansion of slavery. Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793 dramatically increased cotton production, making it a highly profitable crop. This, in turn, fueled the demand for more land and enslaved labor. The number of enslaved people rose from 700,000 in 1790 to over 3 million in 1850. The internal slave trade also boomed after the international trade was banned in 1808, displacing many enslaved people. Then there was financial power and the capacity to borrow. The cotton market enabled America to secure loans from abroad, further facilitating economic expansion. So they was using the money, they was using their revenue from cotton, as collateral for other loans to do other things. All right. It stimulated domestic trade. The cotton industry also spurred trade in agricultural products from the West and manufactured goods from the East, contributing to more interconnected American economy. Wealth generation. Cotton profits brought immense wealth to the South. Well, okay. The Mississippi River Valley and more millionaires per capita. The Mississippi River Valley had more millionaires per capita than any region in the United States. This wealth was generated through the exploitation of enslaved labor, which represented the large financial asset for Southern planters. That's why they went to war. That's why they went to war with the North, because they was making all this money. The North was benefiting too, but they didn't want them to have all that control because they was counting their slaves. Urban growth and development. The Cotton Revolution sparked significant urban growth in the South as cities like New Orleans and Charleston became hubs for a global market connected by trade and steamships. Despite its role in the advancement of the American economy, the cotton industry's reliance on slavery carried a severe human cost. It solidified the institution of slavery, led to the forced migration of millions of Africans, and resulted in the brutal conditions and the denial of human rights for enslaved people. This economic growth was achieved at the expense of Black Americans and created a lasting legacy of racial inequality. You know what I'm saying? Now, that being said, that is the case. There's no way in 40 or 50 hells that we should forgive anybody for anything. See, it's one thing to have not forgive or have hate in your heart and let that hate in your heart prevent you from living a productive life. That's one thing. So oftentimes forgiveness is for the individual and not necessarily for the person that committed the wrong. So on the surface, as individuals, we should forgive a lot of people for a lot of things. But under the surface, a debt is owed. America would not have come as far and prospered in the way it has had it not been for slavery and everything that came along with it. Jim Crow, black codes, our people being sold off at a whim because they didn't see our ancestors as human beings. They saw them as property and things. They had insurance. They traded slaves for this. If there was barter, it was like they didn't care about separating families. There were breeding farms, meaning that once they outlawed the transatlantic slave trade, they still needed one way of producing more slaves. So they had breeding farms where they would blindfold female, male. They could know each other. They could be mother, daughter, sister, brother. They didn't know, and have them to make babies. And then all the other things, feeding little kids to alligators. I mean, it's just a lot that went on. So much went on that these Negro conservatives need to stop being disingenuous. And if they want to make a case, if you go tell the story, tell the whole thing. Do your research and tell the whole thing, but they don't want to because then they don't have a case. Now, I do agree with that these events in history, though not experienced by us today, still has had, just like it has catapulted white privilege to a certain extent. Our people have been put in a disadvantage to a certain extent. A lot a lot has come out of it. You know, drugs, the prison industrial complex, you know, things that happened recently, the 1986 Anti-Drug Act that was written by one of black folks' favorite president, President Biden. He wrote that. He wrote the 1986 Anti-Drug Act that created the 10-to-1 disparity between crack and powder cocaine. He also wrote the 1994 crime bill that another one of America's favorite black president ushered in, Bill Clinton. He signed it. Then you had Obama. He came in. And a lot of these things were ushered in by people that we supported with our vote. You know, we didn't start out as Democrats. Our people started out as Republicans until the Great Compromise of 1877. The first black senators and congressmen were Republican. And I'm not saying that's not a case that we should be Republican today. It's just a case that we should not support a party that does not support us, you know, and stop being fooled by identity politics, you know, thinking that black representation is important. As long as somebody up there look like you, but they up there and they're not doing a damn thing for you, you know, except coming back to you with excuses. You send them back. They getting paid by special interests and the lobbyists and the people who bankroll their campaigns. You know, come on now. You got to get something out of it. You know, this last election, you know, it should be a snapshot of something that we should do each election cycle. Also, your local elections are important. We need to know who our local leaders are: the mayor, DAs, city council, in our in the cities that we live in. They're the closest to us, and what they do, you know, if you own homes, raising taxes and stuff, that affects us all. That affects us also. Not just national elections, but national elections are important. You know, that being said, I'm going to sign off. I'm getting a little better at this. Like and subscribe. Like and subscribe. It don't cost you nothing to like. And if you subscribe and hit the bell, you'll be notified every time I post another video. You know. And try to love each other. I know it's hard. It's hard for me. And I'll see you guys the next time God leaves his footprints in the sky. Peace.
The only way we're going to get some of this oppression and exploitation away from us or aside from us is
Let's hear it from El Boogie.